Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Volume 4 of Akira. Now, Akira is a 6-volume manga series written and illustrated by Katsuhiro Otomo, and the series was published between the years 1982 and 1990. Now, this particular volume of the series was published in 1987. Now, a manga or manga, I've heard it pronounced both ways, and I'm not really sure which way is the correct pronunciation, but a manga is essentially a Japanese comic book or graphic novel. Now, this series was actually adapted into the 1988 animated film of the same name, and the movie actually came out 2 years before the comic book series was even finished. Now, I've already reviewed the first 3 volumes of this series, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to review the final 3 volumes all in a row, and then I'm going to review the movie. Now, in order to explain the plotline of this particular volume of the series, I am going to have to recap the events of the first 3 volumes, and as you can imagine, there will be some spoilers for the first 3 volumes. Now, this entire series is set 38 years after the Third World War, which happened when a mysterious explosion happened over the city of Tokyo, Japan. This explosion was believed to be a nuclear explosion, and this kick-started World War III. But 38 years later, the world has mostly rebuilt itself, but Japan, in the first 3 volumes of this series, is run by a very corrupt and ineffectual government, and the city of Tokyo has been replaced with Neo-Tokyo, which is a city plagued by gang violence and overpopulation and domestic terrorism. Now, the main villain of this series is this emotionally disturbed teenage boy named Tetsuo Shima, who in the beginning of this series is the member of a motorcycle gang, and in the beginning of Volume 1 of this series, he has an encounter with what appears to be a little boy with telekinetic powers, and this encounter causes Tetsuo to develop telekinetic powers of his own. And throughout the course of Volume 1 of this series, Tetsuo develops into an extremely powerful psychic, but these powers come at a devastating price. Basically, he becomes even more unstable, and he even becomes the leader of an enemy gang and actually kills members of his previous gang, causing the gang's leader and his former best friend, Kaneda, to become his worst enemy. And Kaneda becomes the member of this underground resistance against the government, and the only reason he's joined this resistance is, at first, to figure out what happened to Tetsuo, but also because he's sort of fallen head over heels for this girl named Kei, who is a member of the resistance. Now, in Volume 2 of this series, Tetsuo learns that this explosion, which started World War III, was actually caused by a supernatural force known as Akira, and Tetsuo gets it in his head that he will wake Akira up and try to control it. But when he wakes Akira up, he learns that Akira is just a little boy, or at least appears to be a little boy. Obviously, since this was over 30 years before the main events of this story, when Akira caused this explosion to happen, if he was a normal little boy, he would be a grown man at this point. I mean, then again, the military was keeping him in sort of a cryogenic sleep, but if he was a normal child, he probably wouldn't have been able to survive something like that. Now, because of something that happens to Tetsuo at the end of Volume 2, he's largely absent during the events of Volume 3. Now, Volume 3 of this series dealt with these different groups of people, including members of this underground resistance against the government and the Japanese military, and members of the Japanese government all fighting over Akira and fighting for control over him. Now, something happened at the end of Volume 3, which set Akira off and prompted him to cause another explosion, this one completely destroying Neo-Tokyo. So, this volume picks up where Volume 3 left off. Like, it's set 6 months to maybe a year after the events of the previous volume. So, Neo-Tokyo is now in ruins and is pretty much cut off from the rest of the world, and the survivors of Akira's attack on Neo-Tokyo are now fighting over food and supplies. And eventually the survivors break up into 2 different factions. One faction is led by this old woman named Lady Miyako, who is a priestess who is actually a psychic herself. Now, she was introduced in Volume 2 of this series and had a big part to play in Volume 3, but basically she has now taken in a lot of the survivors and has given them food and shelter, and a lot of people look up to her as almost like a religious figure. The other is this group of people who are actually trying to start their own nation called the Great Tokyo Empire, with Akira as its emperor and Tetsuo as Akira's right-hand man. And throughout the story you see these tensions building up between Tetsuo's group and Lady Miyako's group, and you realize that it's leading to all-out war. And Tetsuo is actually feeding these dangerous drugs to his people. Basically, before Akira's attack on Neo-Tokyo, the Japanese military developed these drugs to help suppress psychic abilities, but in some ways they also awaken psychic abilities in certain people as well. And Tetsuo gives some of these drugs to his henchmen, turning them into psychics as well, and he pretty much has a small army of psychics working for him. And Kei, who is one of the main protagonists of the first 3 volumes, and is pretty much the main protagonist of this volume, she eventually becomes an ally of Lady Miyako after helping some of these psychic children, who were also characters from the previous volumes, be reunited with Lady Miyako. Now, I really loved the first 3 volumes of this series, and Volume 4 is no exception, but it's at this point in the series where you really see this story do a complete tonal shift, because prior to this, the Akira storyline was sort of a dystopian story, kind of in the same style as Blade Runner. Actually, Otomo fully admits that Blade Runner was a major influence on this story, but at this point, it goes from being a dystopian story to being a full-out post-apocalyptic story. Well, I can't say it's 100% post-apocalyptic, because it's only Neo-Tokyo that was destroyed. The rest of the world is fine, but Neo-Tokyo is pretty much post-apocalyptic, so it's not 100% post-apocalyptic, but it has elements of the post-apocalyptic genre. Now, this volume of the series, along with the next 2 volumes, definitely seem to take plot elements from stuff like William Golding's The Lord of the Flies, and George Miller's The Road Warrior, and even Stephen King's The Stand to a certain extent. I actually saw a lot of parallels between this and The Stand. Like, just think of Lady Miyako as being sort of like the equivalent of Mother Abigail from The Stand, and look at Tetsuo as being sort of like the equivalent of Randall Flagg. And there's actually some really, really good character drama in this, and it's really the characters that make this story. And the entire story, not just this volume, but the entire series overall, is really an ensemble piece. Like, you really do get to know nearly every character in this story, and pretty much every character has his or her own moment to shine. And in some ways, there really isn't a set protagonist in this story, nor is there really a set antagonist. Now, if I were to pick a character who could qualify as the main protagonist of this particular volume of the series, I would say it would definitely be the character of Kei. In a lot of ways, this is really Kei's story. Now, Kaneda was arguably the main protagonist of the first 3 volumes, but something happened to Kaneda at the end of Volume 3, so he's mainly absent throughout this volume, and he doesn't show up till the end of this volume. So really, for this particular volume of the series, it is really Kei who is the main protagonist. And to be honest, I've always found Kei to be more of a proper protagonist than Kaneda is. Don't get me wrong, Kaneda is an awesome character, but to me, Kei is a far more interesting character than he is. And it's really in this volume where Kei learns how important she is. It turns out that Kei is actually a psychic medium. Now, she doesn't have any powers of her own, but it turns out that other psychics could sort of possess her and use their powers through her, which you saw the Espers doing to her during the events of Volume 2 of this series. And the book really does explore the relationship between Kei and this woman named Chiyoko, who is sort of like a mother figure to her. And Chiyoko is a freaking badass, and she freaking destroys some of Tetsuo's men in this story. The book also really explores the relationship between Kei and this man named Ryu. I know I butchered his name, and I know that's not actually how his name is pronounced, but this character was in the first 3 volumes, and prior to Akira's attack on Neo-Tokyo, he was a member of this underground resistance against the Japanese government. And it's here where you really find out that Ryu and Kei actually do have love for each other, despite the fact that there's a huge age difference between the two of them, and it's only Chiyoko who kind of steps in and kind of shuts that shit down. Also, you find out that after Neo-Tokyo was destroyed, Ryu became sort of an alcoholic, but you see him try to redeem himself by really trying to stop Akira and Tetsuo, and he actually becomes allies with an American soldier who was sent in by the United States government to figure out what's actually going on in Neo-Tokyo. Another character who gets a lot of development in this story is the Colonel, who, in the first 3 volumes, was sort of like an antagonist in this story, but here you see an antagonist pretty much become a protagonist, because you really learn to care about this character in this particular volume of the series. And you realize that all he wanted to do was protect Neo-Tokyo, and the fact that he failed at that is actually really heartbreaking. And there's also a really heartbreaking moment in this book where one of the Colonel's men, prior to Akira's attack on Neo-Tokyo, tries to speak to the Colonel, basically tries to go with him, and the Colonel turns him down, and once again, it's a really heartbreaking moment in the story. Also, in this volume, you find out a great deal more about the Espers, who were these psychic children that the Japanese government was experimenting on, and it's in this volume where you really find out the origin of the Espers, and you find out that they're not exactly children. Like, they have the minds of children, but in reality, they're actually old people, pretty much, because they were there before World War III, which was 38 years prior to the events of this story. And you find out that Akira was actually one of them, but even then you never truly find out what exactly Akira is, because nobody can figure out how Akira became so powerful. And you almost get this idea that Akira is perhaps a vessel for the very force that holds the universe together. For all we know, he could even be God incarnate. So even when you find out the origin of Akira, there's still a lot of mystery surrounding this character, and even Tetsuo, who is Akira's right-hand man, does not fully understand him. And there's also a lot of characterization for Tetsuo in this story, because even though he's arguably the main antagonist of this story, he's still a very three-dimensional character, and you also get flashbacks to his childhood in here, where you get some idea of why he's the way he is. The book also really explores the relationship between Tetsuo and this young girl named Cody. I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right, but she was this young girl who was pretty much taken off the streets and was made into one of Tetsuo's sex slaves, but she's the only one who survived an encounter with him, and the two of them develop this really strange relationship with each other. I'm not sure if I would really call it love per se, or more like Stockholm Syndrome, but their relationship is really interesting because basically in the story you see Tetsuo, Cody, and Akira essentially develop a family unit in a way. Once again, every character here is very developed and very three-dimensional. Now, in this book and in the Akira series overall, there is a lot of political and social commentary. For example, Akira is definitely a metaphor for the atom bomb and what happens when mankind tampers with forces that they don't understand. And also, when you look at the Great Tokyo Empire, there are a lot of definite parallels between the Great Tokyo Empire and Japan prior and during World War II. In the book, there are also a lot of allegories for drug use and drug addiction. Like, in the story, you realize that Tetsuo is absolutely dependent on these pills. And there's even a point where he tries to go cold turkey. And a lot of this volume in particular really does focus on how these drugs affect Tetsuo. But these drugs in some ways are sort of both a blessing and a curse, because when Tetsuo kicks them, that means there's nothing to suppress his power anymore. And I thought this was a really good volume of the series. Now, I have read volumes 5 and 6, like, I've read the whole series already, and this is definitely one of the high points of the series, in my opinion. So yeah, that was my review on Volume 4 of Akira, and bye.